Another problem with this supporting argument is the fact that its first premise is false. Bahnsen's transcendental argument for God does not fit into any of Stein's 11 categories.
Mr. Zingler says you can't prove a universal negative. That's false in the first place. Of course you can. For example, you could disprove the statement that there are polka-dotted geese. That would be a universal negative. You can disprove that. But
what you are witnessing is the second in a planned series of videos reviewing the Bahnsen-Stein debate on Does God Exist? This video is divided into two parts. In the first part, I will analyze the organizational structure of Dr. Stein's opening statement, as well as how much time he allocated to each section of his speech. In the second part, I will assess the content of Dr. Stein's opening statement itself from both technical and rhetorical perspectives. My intent is to be not only fair, but charitable. Where appropriate, I will try to steelman his arguments. Speaking of my assessment, I want to review how I assess debate performances. Again, I look at three things. First, I look at what topics did the debater choose to talk about, and how much time did they allocate to each topic. Second, I look at how effective the debater was in making their arguments. I do this in two ways. First, from a technical perspective, I provide an objective assessment of whether the argument is sound, if deductive, or strong, if inductive. In past videos, I called this a logical perspective, but I've decided to relabel it the technical perspective, to emphasize that I am not just interested in the logical inference, but also in the truth of the premises. Second, from a rhetorical perspective, I offer my subjective assessment of whether the argument is likely to be persuasive to an audience. Third, I look at the debater's clash with the other debater's arguments. If one debater says X, does the opposing debater clash with the arguments for X? I look at items 1 and 2 in all speeches. I consider 3 in all speeches except for the opening statements. With that in mind, let's turn to Dr. Stein's opening statement. Dr. Stein's opening statement, as I interpret it, seems to be divided into 3 sections. I say the words as I interpret it because there is no official transcript of Dr. Stein's opening statement from Dr. Stein himself. If you do a search, you can find a transcript of the entire debate online, but the transcribers, just like the rest of us, are making educated guesses because it's simply there was no transcript provided by Dr. Stein, and as he delivered the speech, he didn't do what in debate we call signposting, where he would clearly identify what the section of the speech is. So what you're seeing on the screen is my educated guess as to what I think the organizational structure is, but I could definitely be wrong about that. It is my attempt to be charitable, though, and sort of reverse engineer what I think his structure was. So at the highest level, I think what I call Zoom level 1, I think Dr. Stein's opening statement is comprised of 3 sections. An introduction, a section where he talks about theism, atheism, and the burden of proof, and then finally a review of proofs for God's existence. His opening statement in total consists of 2,804 words. If you divide that number by 15 minutes, that gives you a speaking rate of almost 187 words per minute, which is a bit on the fast side, but not too fast. My second observation about this is that Stein's introduction alone used almost 23% of his speaking time. If you watched my first video in this series, you know what I'm going to say next. I think that's crazy. What he said in his introduction simply wasn't worth that amount of speaking time. And notice I'm focused on the percentage, not the content itself. So I'm not saying his introduction isn't important. I'm just saying it's not 23% important. Let's call this next view of his organizational structure Zoom level 2. In section 1, his introductory remarks, Stein covered 3 subtopics: the importance of the debate topic, the definition of atheist, and the definition of God. I need to say a little bit about subsection B, defining the word atheist, in order to set up what I'm going to say in just a minute about section 3. According to Stein, an atheist is not someone who denies the existence of God, nor is an atheist someone who merely lacks the belief that God exists. Rather, Stein says, quote, an atheist says that he has examined the proofs that are offered by the theist, and he finds them inadequate. This is why Stein devotes most of his speech not to making a positive case for the non-existence of God, but to reviewing various theistic arguments and explaining why he finds them inadequate. In section 2 of his speech, Stein talked about theism, atheism, and the burden of proof. Again, as I read him, he covered 3 subtopics. First, in subsection A, he appeals to an argument which I've never seen given a name in the literature, and so I'm going to call it the lack of proof argument. In subsection B, he talks about the burden of proof. And in subsection C, he talks about the alleged difficulty involved with proving universal negative claims. In section 3, Stein reviewed 13 categories of attempted or alleged proofs or lines of evidence for God's existence. I wasn't able to fit all of them onto a single slide, so the remaining categories are on the next slide. My main criticism of section 3 is that Dr. Stein didn't address Bahnsen's transcendental argument. Normally, when I assess debates like these, when the atheist goes second, I say that in the atheist's opening statement, the atheist should ignore the theist's opening statement so that the atheist can build a positive case of their own. But if the atheist is going to take the approach that Stein did, which is to try to defend a lack of belief in God by shooting down all of the theist's arguments, then Stein needs to adapt his opening statement during the debate itself to address whatever arguments his opponent raises. Unfortunately, Stein didn't do that. Stein's speech said nothing about transcendental arguments for the existence of God. As people watched the debate live or listened to a recording of his speech on YouTube or audio cassette, however they listened to it, I'm sure a lot of them were thinking to themselves, Dr. Stein, that's nice and everything that you can talk about all these other arguments, but Dr. Bahnsen didn't use any of those arguments. When are you going to talk about Dr. Bahnsen's transcendental argument? And so, unfortunately, I think this made Stein, or at least his opening statement, look silly. Turning now to subsection 1a, I don't have too much to say here. As Stein notes, the existence of God is one of the most important topics, quote, in the whole field of religion, end quote. I would add that the existence of God is also one of the most important in philosophy, and that the existence or non-existence of God is a major element in a person's worldview. Overall, I gave Stein a positive assessment from both technical and rhetorical perspectives. Next, let's move on to Stein's definitions of atheism and atheist. Before we listen to what Dr. Stein had to say, I want to begin by quoting something written by Purdue University philosopher Paul Draper. I want to quote his article on atheism and agnosticism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He wrote, quote, "The word atheism is polysemous. It has multiple related meanings. In the psychological sense of the word, atheism is a psychological state, specifically the state of being an atheist, where an atheist is defined as someone who is not a theist, and a theist is defined as someone who believes that God exists, or that there are gods, lowercase g. This generates the following definition. Atheism is the psychological state of lacking the belief that God exists. In philosophy, however, and more specifically in the philosophy of religion, the term atheism is standardly used to refer to the proposition that God does not exist, or more broadly to the proposition that there are no gods, lowercase g. Thus, to be an atheist on this definition, it does not suffice to suspend judgment on whether there is a God, even though that implies a lack of theistic belief. Instead, one must deny that God exists. this metaphysical sense of the word, and then I cut off the quotation because the important point here is that Draper is distinguishing between two senses of the word atheism, psychological and metaphysical. Let's keep these two senses in mind as we listen to what Dr. Stein said in his opening statement.
First, let me make clear what atheism is and is not. I think this is a very commonly misunderstood subject.
So notice three things about the beginning of Stein's remarks. First, his first sentence implies or presupposes that the word atheism is not polysemous. That is, that it does not have multiple legitimate meanings. But as we just saw from Draper, the word atheism is polysemous. Even if Stein correctly identifies one legitimate meaning of the word, the psychological sense, it doesn't follow that Bahnsen was incorrect when he identified another legitimate meaning, the metaphysical sense. Second, Stein's first sentence implies or presupposes that there is an objective fact of the matter about the definition of words, including the definition of atheism. And again, I think that is false because there is no way for definitions to be objective. Words mean no more and no less than what language users agree that they mean. And by language users, I don't mean, for example, all users of the English language, but groups of language users. In the context of academic philosophy of religion, the dominant definition of the word atheism is the metaphysical definition. But among Westerners who are non-philosophers and among Westerners who self-identify as atheist, the psychological definition of atheism is either the dominant definition or at least one of the dominant definitions. And third, my third comment about the beginning of Stein's remarks is that Dr. Stein says that the definition of the word atheism is, quote, a very commonly misunderstood subject, end quote. I find that very interesting because it raises the question of why. Why is the definition of the word atheism so commonly misunderstood? Proponents of the psychological definition, including Stein, don't seem to recognize, or they do recognize and they forget, that their definition seems to deviate from popular usage, both among philosophers and among non-philosophers who do not self-identify as atheists. It is extremely rare for a proponent of the psychological definition to begin a conversation with the following statement, quote, I recognize that most people define the word atheism in a metaphysical sense, but I want to use the word atheism in a psychological sense, end quote. Instead, proponents of the psychological definition typically just presuppose their own preferred definition without calling out that that's what they're doing, and then they express surprise or even dismay at what they claim is a, quote, misunderstanding, end quote. Let's keep going.
Atheists do not say that they can prove that there's no God.
Now, this is probably pedantic on my part, but I can't help but notice that Stein has now switched from talking about the word atheism to talking about the word atheist. But when we try to infer a definition of atheism from what he says about atheists, he seems to be simultaneously introducing and rejecting a third possible definition of the word atheism. In addition to the psychological and metaphysical senses, we now have what I'm going to call the proof sense of atheism. The proposition, quote, it is possible to prove God does not exist, end quote. I don't like that sense of the word atheism at all. Here's why. Nobody defines the word theism in the proof sense. That is to say, nobody defines theism as the proposition it is possible to prove God exists. So why is he introducing and then rejecting this asymmetrical, bizarre definition of atheism, which nobody holds? Let's now return to Stein's remarks. Stein continues.
An atheist is not someone who denies that there is a God. Rather, an atheist says that he has examined the proofs that are offered by the theist, and he finds them inadequate.
So Stein is now suggesting a fourth definition of atheism. I will call this fourth definition the absence of proof psychological sense atheism. Now, Stein is free to offer these idiosyncratic definitions of words if he wishes to do so, but I think this is a bad idea. First, from a debate perspective, this is a waste of precious speaking time. Second, I don't for 1 second believe that all self-identified atheists have examined theistic proofs any more than I believe that all self-identified theists have examined theistic proofs. And third, it is a double-edged sword. At this point, theists could listen to Stein, interrupt him, and simply reply, okay, theists do not claim that they can prove that God exists. Rather, the theist says that he has examined the proofs offered by those who think they can prove the non-existence of God and found those proofs inadequate. And then what is Stein going to say? Stein is going to get bogged down in an unproductive and ultimately unwinnable debate about semantics. So this is just a bad idea. Let's keep going and return to Stein's remarks.
Now, if I were to say that this gentleman sitting on the front step could fly by flapping his arms, I would be making a kind of unusual statement. And it would be up to me or him to demonstrate that he could fly. If he can't demonstrate it, then we don't believe that he can fly. Now, if he doesn't demonstrate it right now, that doesn't mean he can't fly. It just means he can't fly right now. Now, so that we do not deny that he can fly because he can't demonstrate it right now, but we say he has not proven his case. And therefore, we do not believe that he can fly until he does so, prove so.
Stein's flying human example actually backfires on him. Stein's example asks us to consider the hypothesis that the gentleman in the front row at the debate can fly. The way he describes the example, Stein makes it sound as if the only available and relevant evidence to that hypothesis is the present inability of the gentleman in the front row to perform a demonstration. But in Stein's hypothetical, we have other evidence besides the fact that the gentleman did not perform a demonstration. We also have our background knowledge, including our knowledge of the laws of physics, our knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, and our knowledge that human beings don't fly. On the basis of background knowledge alone, we don't need to suspend belief, as Stein claims, and say that the flying human hypothesis is merely unproven. We are fully justified in concluding that the flying human hypothesis is false. To see this, consider propositions B1, B2, B3, and E. The conjunction of B1, B2, and B3 constitute the relevant background information. Humans are primates, not birds. No humans have wings, and no human being has ever been observed to fly by flapping his arms. That's the relevant background information. E, the evidence to be explained, in this case, is the hypothetical evidence. Hypothetically, Dr. Stein claims that the man can fly by flapping his arms. Well, using these propositions, B and E, we can then construct the following argument. Premise 1. The evidence relevant to humans flying by arm flapping, i.e. B and E, is known to be true. Premise 2. Prior to examining the evidence to be explained, E, the arm flapping theory is maximally implausible, i.e. it's implausible based on our background knowledge B, while the denial of the arm flapping theory is maximally plausible. The explanatory power of the arm flapping theory is not greater than that of its denial. That's premise 4. Premise 5, so the denial of the arm flapping theory is the best explanation of the relevant evidence, again, where relevant evidence means B and E. 6, therefore it is epistemically probable that the arm flapping theory is false. But to use Stein's wording, the conclusion, or 6, entails that the arm flapping theory is not only unproven, but that it is disproven. Let's now go back to listening to Dr. Stein.
And this is what an atheist says about the existence of God. He says the case is unproven, not disproven. So an atheist is really someone who is without a belief in God or who does not believe in a God. It is not someone who denies the existence of a God or who says that one does not exist or can prove that one does not exist.
Okay, so after wasting over a minute of speaking time, we finally get to hear Stein's definition. After all is said and done, it turns out that Stein is using the word atheism in a psychological sense. He could have saved himself and everyone else a lot of time by just saying the single sentence, "By atheism, I do not mean the proposition God does not exist, rather I mean the psychological state of lacking the belief that God exists." Everything else that Stein said in this subsection was unnecessary and I think undermined his credibility by using a silly hypothetical example. Because I reject the idea of objective definitions, I didn't assign a technical rating to Stein's confused remarks about defining the words atheism or atheist, but from a rhetorical perspective, I rated this with 1 down arrow. Next, let's move on to Stein's definition of God. As Stein correctly pointed out, we need to have an idea of what God means before we can talk about evidence or proofs of God. Stein adopts the definition which both Father Copleston and Bertrand Russell used in their famous debate on God's existence. I thought this was okay, and so I gave him a positive assessment with a single up arrow. Let's move on to section 2, Theism, Atheism, and the Burden of Proof. Here's what Stein said in his opening statement. In subsection A, Stein discusses what I will call the lack of proof argument. Let's listen to Stein in his own words.
Okay, now, throughout history, 11 major kinds of evidence or proof have been offered for the existence of God. In my campus visits, I have heard all kinds of other things offered as proof, but they basically fall into those 11 categories with some juggling. And if these 11 proofs do not work out logically or lead to logical self-contradictions, then we can only say that God's existence is not proved. It's unproven, not disproven, as I mentioned before.
Okay, so that's what Dr. Stein said in his opening statement. There's an implied argument here which I have reconstructed. I think his argument can be reconstructed as follows. Premise 1, if none of the 11 categories of theistic evidence or proof are successful, then theism is unproven. Premise 2, none of the 11 categories of theistic evidence or proof are successful, therefore 3, theism is unproven. This is not a good argument for the unprovenness of theism. Let's take a look at premise 1. Stein admits that he had heard all kinds of other things offered as proofs, but he claims they basically fall into those 11 categories with some juggling. But let's ignore that for a moment and instead focus on the first sentence. Stein's reference to history and his own personal interactions with theists suggests the following supporting argument. Premise 1a, all theistic evidence or proof thus far examined have fallen into one of the 11 categories. Premise 1b, therefore all theistic evidence or proof fall into one of the 11 categories. Therefore, 1, if none of the 11 categories of theistic evidence or proof are successful, then theism is unproven. The problem, however, is that even if premise 1a were true, it doesn't give us a good reason to believe that the intermediate conclusion, premise 1b, is true. 1a does not entail the truth of premise 1b, so the inference from 1a to 1b is not a valid deductive argument. Is it a good inductive argument, what we would call an inductively strong argument? No, premise 1a by itself does not make premise 1b probable. Now, it may be the case that the theistic evidence examined by Stein is neither exhaustive nor representative of the available theistic evidences or proof. Or it may be the case that there is a successful theistic proof or item of evidence that has not yet been discovered. So the inference from 1a to 1b is also not a strong inductive argument. In fact, it's interesting to me how, at various points in the debate, Stein seems to suggest that that it is impossible to justify a negative existential statement or particular negative, such as the proposition God does not exist. But premise 2, which says none of the 11 categories of theistic evidence or proof are successful, is itself a negative existential statement. Why does Stein think that he can justify that negative existential statement, but not the metaphysical sense of atheism? If he has an argument, he doesn't share it. Another problem with this supporting argument is the fact that its first premise is false. Bahnsen's transcendental argument for God does not fit into any of Stein's 11 categories, and therefore there is no good reason to affirm premise 1 of Stein's implied argument, which I'm calling the lack of proof argument. Because the lack of proof argument fails, I've given Stein a negative technical assessment with 2 down arrows. I also don't think this portion of his speech was rhetorically effective, so I've given him 1 down arrow. Probably could have given him 2, but I was feeling sorry for him and gave him 1. The next subsection of Stein's speech is where he talks about the burden of proof.
Now, if I assert that this gentleman can fly by flapping his arms, as I said, the burden of proof was on him. Supposing I make a more complicated statement. Supposing I say that my dog can talk in complete sentences. Okay, well, again, I'm making a kind of unusual statement, and it's up to me to offer the evidence. So I better be prepared to do that, or I better be prepared to have people not believe what I say.
Here Stein is giving 2 examples. A man can fly by flapping his arms, and my dog can talk in complete sentences. And, he says, the person who makes such claims has the burden of proof. I agree with Stein's conclusion, the person who makes such claims has the burden of proof, but I'm not in love with the way he defends that conclusion. As Stein says, both of these claims are, quote, unusual statements, end quote. This might give the impression that only unusual or extraordinary statements have a burden of proof, but I don't think that's quite right. Someone who affirms what we might call usual or ordinary statements also has a burden of proof. To see this, let's turn to what philosopher and fellow atheist Keith Parsons has written. Keith Parsons is a philosopher of religion and a philosopher of science, having earned 2 PhDs, one in each discipline. His first published book was entitled God and the Burden of Proof. What he wrote in that book is directly relevant to our discussion. He wrote, quote, "It therefore seems that insofar as theists claim to know that God exists, they must be willing to back that claim with grounds adequate to justify that belief. A curious observer might wonder why atheists are not required to shoulder a burden of proof. Why don't they have to provide positive grounds in favor of their position rather than simply criticizing the arguments of theists? To understand this asymmetry of epistemic burdens, we must return to Flu's initial definition of atheism. On Flu's definition, an atheist is simply one who lacks belief in God. But how does one go about justifying the not having of a belief? In point of fact, it seems one has no responsibility to justify the not having of a particular belief unless there is some reason that it should be believed." End quote. Notice that Parsons here refers to the late British philosopher Anthony Flew, who had famously argued in favor of the psychological definition of atheism. Parsons adopts Flu's definition. But because most people reject the psychological definition in favor of the metaphysical one, I think it would be useful to paraphrase Parsons' statement using the metaphysical definition. Using the word atheism in the metaphysical sense, we might paraphrase and summarize that quotation of Parsons as follows. Premise 1, any claim to possess knowledge must be grounded, i.e. backed up with reasons, arguments, or evidence that warrant the belief. Premise 2, atheism in the psychological sense, i.e. lack of belief in God, is not a claim to possess knowledge. Therefore, 3, atheism in the psychological sense does not need grounding. This seems quite reasonable because, as Parsons wrote, a person, quote, has no responsibility to justify the not having of a particular belief unless there is some reason that it should be believed, end quote. But what about metaphysical atheists? Do they bear a burden of proof? On the one hand, it seems that Parsons' remarks would support the following argument. Premise 1, any claim to possess knowledge must be grounded, i.e. backed up with reasons, arguments, or evidence that warrant the belief. Premise 4, both theism as well as atheism in the metaphysical sense, i.e. the proposition, God does not exist, are claims to possess knowledge. Therefore, 5, both theism and atheism in the metaphysical sense require grounding. Notice, however, that this argument treats all claims to possess knowledge as having an equal plausibility or probability. As Parsons himself suggests, however, in a different passage, this is not the case. Quote, when a claim asserts the existence of something that is greatly at odds with our previous experience, we rightly regard the claim very probably false until we are given truly strong evidence in its favor. All of God's alleged powers and attributes are of a very extraordinary sort. As defined by Orthodox theists, God is not constituted of energy or matter. He does not exist in space and time, though he can act in space and time, and he created the universe, though he himself is uncreated. Further, God is said to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. Clearly, as theists themselves insist, God is entirely different from the finite, limited, imperfect, material sorts of beings that we encounter in the material world. Therefore, if we are to judge how likely something is to exist on the basis of what we have previously known to be the case, we must rate the likelihood of God's existence very low indeed. Further, since extraordinary claims must be supported with extraordinary evidence, we must insist on very solid evidence indeed before we affirm the existence of God. End quote. Here Parsons suggests that theists and atheists might not have symmetrical burdens of proof because theism, but not atheism, has a low prior probability. Although he doesn't use these exact words, it's worth asking, why does Parsons think theism has a low prior probability? Well, because he thinks theism conflicts with, quote, what we have previously known to be the case, end quote, or what I'm calling background knowledge. Prior probabilities are normally determined by factors extrinsic to a hypothesis, such as our empirical knowledge of the world. But what if there were intrinsic probabilities, where we only consider factors intrinsic to a hypothesis? How might intrinsic probabilities inform the way we think about the burden of proof? Let's consider that next. And here I'm going to paraphrase, almost reading word for word, but not quite, a 2-page PDF file that Paul Draper had given to me a few years ago to post on my now defunct blog, The Secular Outpost. Unfortunately, when we moved that blog off of patheos.com and onto infidels.org at secularfrontier.infidels.org, that particular post in the PDF file didn't transfer correctly, and so I don't think that PDF file is currently available online. But what I'm about to read to you is almost, not quite, but almost a word-for-word reproduction of what's in that. So the title of the PDF file that Draper sent me was The Question, on the issue of God's existence, who bears the burden of proof? Section 1, clarifying the question. Draper defines an agnostic as a person who has considered the question of whether or not a theistic God exists, but is neither a theist nor an atheist. He defines the word proof as evidence or support, factors extrinsic to a hypothesis that raise or lower the probability of that hypothesis being true. And then he defines the question, who has a burden of proof, as meaning who needs evidence in order for their defining belief to be rational. He defines the word theist as a person who believes, that is, has a credence of 0.9 or higher, that a theistic God, that is, a personal creator of the physical world who is worthy of worship and unconditional allegiance, exists. and he defines the word atheist metaphysically as a person who believes, that is, has a credence of 0.9 or higher, that no theistic God exists. Section 2, he says there are 4 possible answers to the question. Answer A, both the theist and the atheist. He says a possible attempt to justify this answer would be that no belief that is not self-evident is rational unless it is supported by evidence. Possible answer B, neither the theist nor the atheist. A possible attempt to justify this answer would be the idea that probabilities independent of all evidence are purely subjective. Possible answer C, the atheist, but not the theist. A possible attempt to justify this answer would be the idea that, well, not just the idea, but the fact that the vast majority of people in the world are theists. And then possible answer D, the theist, but not the atheist. Draper's preferred answer is D, and what follows is his attempt to justify answer D. Section 3, criteria for assessing intrinsic probability. By modesty, he says the modesty of a hypothesis. Well, let me back up for a second. So when Draper uses the word hypothesis, he doesn't mean hypothesis the way that a scientist would. When he uses the word hypothesis, what he really means is a proposition that we do not know with certainty to be true and we do not know with certainty to be false. That's just what he means by hypothesis. So when he talks about modesty, he's saying the modesty of a hypothesis is inversely proportional to its content, to how much it says. Hypotheses that say less, for example, because they make fewer claims, or less specific claims, or claims that are narrower in scope, are, other things being equal, more likely to be true than hypotheses that say more. And coherence, the coherence of a hypothesis depends on how well its components fit together. If we abstract from all factors extrinsic to a hypothesis, then the only thing that could affect the epistemic probability of that hypothesis is how much it says and how well what it says fits together. No other factors affecting probability could be intrinsic to the hypothesis. Now, those of you who have read Richard Swinburne know that Swinburne says that we determine intrinsic probability based on simplicity. So Draper asks, what about simplicity? His argument is that all facets of simplicity are either reducible to modesty and coherence or are irrelevant to the probability of a theory. Section 4. Here Draper compares the intrinsic probabilities of naturalism and supernaturalism. Naturalism, or in other contexts he's called it source physicalism, is the statement that the physical world existed prior to any mental world and caused any mental world to come into existence. Supernaturalism, or what he's called in other contexts source idealism, is the statement that the mental world existed prior to any physical world and caused any physical world to come into existence. Otherism is the statement that both naturalism and supernaturalism are false. Naturalism and supernaturalism are equally probable intrinsically because they are equally modest and coherent. Since the intrinsic epistemic probability of otherism is greater than 0, naturalism and supernaturalism are each less probable intrinsically than their denials. So both naturalists and supernaturalists bear a burden of proof, and that burden is equal. Section 5 is where Draper compares the intrinsic probabilities of theism and atheism. Theism is a very specific version of supernaturalism, and so is many times, i.e. at least 10 times, less probable intrinsically than supernaturalism. Naturalism is a specific version of atheism, and so is many times less probable than atheism. Thus, since naturalism and supernaturalism are equally probable intrinsically, it follows that atheism is many times more probable intrinsically than theism, which entails that atheism has a high intrinsic probability, certainly higher than 0.9, while theism has a very low intrinsic probability, certainly lower than 0.1. And therefore, Draper says, theists, but not atheists, bear the burden of proof. And so you can see that on the burden of proof, I've assessed Stein's remarks negatively. From a technical perspective, I was a little bit easier on him this time and gave him a single down arrow. But from a rhetorical perspective, I was harder on him and gave him 2 down arrows. Let's now move on to section 2C, universal negative claims. To begin, I first need to define a categorical proposition. A categorical proposition is a proposition which asserts or denies relationships between terms or classes. An example of a categorical proposition would be the sentence, "All humans are mortal." That sentence is a categorical proposition because it asserts roughly that all members of the class of humans are members of the class of mortals. Using that example, we can build a matrix that shows the 4 possibilities or permutations, if you will, of that categorical proposition. And so it's useful to compare and contrast things from a quantitative and a qualitative perspective. From a qualitative perspective, we're interested in whether the proposition affirms or negates something. And from a quantitative perspective, we're interested if it's making a universal statement or a particular statement. This will make more sense as we work our way through the matrix. So first, a universal affirmative is a proposition which has the general form all S are P. And so in this example, we would say all humans are mortal. That's a universal affirmative. The universal negative is a proposition which has the general form no S are P. And so in this example, it would be no humans are mortal. A particular affirmative would be a proposition which has the general form some S are P. And so in this case, some humans are mortal. And then finally, a particular negative is a proposition which has the general form some S are not P. And so in this example, some humans are not mortal. Let's now turn to what Dr. Stein had to say about universal negative claims in his opening statement.
Okay, now how easy would it be to show that this gentleman cannot fly or that my dog cannot talk in complete sentences? As I mentioned before, we get into a real problem when we're trying to show that something cannot happen or that something does not exist. For example, if I wanted to prove that unicorns do not exist, I can examine this room and we can find out that there are definitely no unicorns in this room. That's a small area. But if to prove the general non-existence of something like unicorns, we would have to search the entire universe simultaneously, and then we could only say that no unicorns existed at the moment we searched the universe. But, maybe they were there 5 minutes before, or if we only searched the whole Earth, maybe they were on another planet at the time. I mean, there are all kinds of other possibilities. So you cannot prove that something does not exist. And that's why, as I mentioned before, the definition of an atheist is not someone who thinks he has proven that God does not exist, because you cannot.
So what precisely is Dr. Stein's argument here? I think his argument can be, which I'm calling the unprovability of universal negatives argument, can be reconstructed as follows. Premise 1, the only way to prove a universal negative is to exhaustively search for all possible sources of evidence of a thing and find no evidence. Premise 2, but it is impossible to conduct an exhaustive search. Therefore, 3, it is impossible to prove a universal negative. This is not a good argument. But before I explain why, let's continue on with what I consider to be the follow-on argument, which I'm calling the unprovability of God's non-existence argument. It says, premise 3, or it continues, 3, therefore it is impossible to prove a universal negative. Premise 4, the proposition God does not exist is a universal negative. Therefore, 5, it is impossible to prove God does not exist. Let's now go back to the first argument, the unprovability of universal negatives argument. Premise 1 is false. If X is something that involves a self-contradiction, then it is possible to prove that X does not exist. Doing so does not require conducting an exhaustive search of all possible empirical evidence for X. And therefore, the conclusion is also false. The unprovability of universal negatives argument fails. Let's now take a look at the unprovability of God's non-existence argument. Specifically, let's take a look at premise 4. Apparently, both Stein and Bahnsen believed that premise 4 is true. And so let's take a listen to something, or take a look at something Bahnsen said. Years after his debate with Gordon Stein, Greg Bahnsen released a collection of 12 audio cassettes entitled Michael Martin Under the Microscope. According to my notes, the title of tape 3 is Terms, Burden of Proof. I no longer have the audio cassettes, and even if I did, I would no longer have a way to play them. So I no longer have the ability to double check my notes for accuracy. But for what it is worth, the words you see on the screen are my transcription that I took 20 years ago of what Bahnsen said on that audio cassette. He said, quote, "It's standard fare these days to point out that a universal negative cannot be proven in an a posteriori fashion. On the basis of experience, how could I prove universally there is no God? God might be on the backside of the fourth moon of Jupiter. Since I haven't examined the backside of the fourth moon of Jupiter, it's at least possible that God exists and I haven't encountered him yet. So to say that there is no God is a very strong claim. Atheists usually get hammered about that they're claiming too much. In fact, in order to say there is no God, you would have to be omniscient. But if you were omniscient, you would be God. Therefore, the only person who could say there is no God is God. God would not deny himself, so no one can say there is no God." End quote. Now, two comments here. First of all, I'm surprised that Bahnsen would use such a terrible example to make his point, since God, as he defines the word God, is by definition an immaterial being. So his definition of God would not lead to an empirical prediction that God is located at a specific location in the universe, much less the backside of the fourth moon of Jupiter. So that I think that's a silly example. But more importantly, I think that Dr. Bahnsen, as well as Dr. Stein, were both wrong that God is that the claim God does not exist is in fact a universal negative. And to help, support my counter argument here, I'm going to quote William Lane Craig. Craig refuted essentially the same argument, what I'm calling the unprovability of God's non-existence argument, in his famous debate with Frank Zindler. Let's listen to what Craig said against Zindler.
Mr. Zindler says you can't prove a universal negative. That's false in the first place. Of course you can. For example, you could disprove the statement that there are polka-dotted geese. That would be a universal negative. You can disprove that. But more importantly, the statement that God does not exist is not a universal negative. It's a singular negative statement. And certainly you can prove negative singular statements, such as there is no planet between Venus and the Earth. You can provide arguments to show that a singular negative statement is true, but he hasn't done it.
So as shown on this revised matrix that's specific to the existence or non-existence of God, capital G, or gods, plural, lowercase g, theism is a particular affirmative, and atheism in its metaphysical sense is a particular negative. And so both Dr. Stein and Dr. Bahnsen were mistaken in claiming or suggesting that atheism in a metaphysical sense is a universal negative. But this entails that premise 4 of the unprovability of God's non-existence argument is false. Thus, every part of the unprovability of God's non-existence argument is wrong. In fact, we can take the issue a step further. This chart, which oversimplifies things, lists two ways to defend negative propositions. One way to defend a universal negative is to use what I call an impossibility argument. And one way to defend a particular negative is to explain what I call an improbability argument. I'll explain each type of argument in just a moment, but for right now I want to give two caveats. First, I do not claim that this is an exhaustive summary of the various argument patterns which might be used to support universal or particular negatives. Second, my names for these argument patterns are not standard. For example, a standard name for one type of improbability argument is evidential argument. And the standard name for one type of impossibility argument is logical arguments. For example, J.L. Mackey's famous logical argument from evil argues that God is impossible because theism is logically inconsistent with evil. I don't like the name logical argument because I think it sounds funny to non-philosophers. Imagine an atheist saying, I'm going to defend a logical argument for atheism, and that invites the reply, as opposed to what? An illogical argument for atheism? So I think that name is just silly, and I think that the non-standard names that I'm suggesting make more intuitive sense. Here is one version of an impossibility argument, what the philosopher Ted Drange calls an incompatible properties argument, as applied to the existence of God. The basic idea is to show that if God existed, then he would have two properties, P1 and P2. The next step is to show that property P1 entails some third property, P3, while property P2 entails the denial of property P3. Since it is possible for any being both to have and not have property P3, or more generally, to have and not have any property, it follows that that being does not exist because that being cannot exist. Here is one version of an improbability argument. The argument itself is a deductive argument, not an inductive argument, albeit a deductive argument about inductive probabilities. Furthermore, it's a valid deductive argument. It's valid because the conclusion follows from the premises. In the context of the problem of evil, or arguments from evil, the type of argument you see on the screen is usually called an evidential argument. But if you want to get technical, it's really a Humean argument, which would be a subtype of evidential argument. The basic idea is this. You start by identifying some rival proposition which is logically inconsistent with theism, such as naturalism or source physicalism. You then identify some fact, such as the biological role of pain and pleasure, to serve as your evidence, or E. That's premise one. The next step, or series of steps, is to compare the probabilities of theism and the rival proposition by doing intrinsic and extrinsic comparisons. Premise 2 does the intrinsic comparison. Here the word intrinsic means the content of the proposition. So the intrinsic probability of a proposition is its probability based solely on its content. It does not consider any empirical evidence, such as E. The concept of intrinsic probability is, as we saw in an earlier slide from Draper, is based on modesty, or how much a proposition says, coherence, or how well the parts of a proposition fit together, and nothing else. It is an objective fact that source physicalism is intrinsically more probable than theism. Why? First, source physicalism says less than theism says, and in that sense, source physicalism is more modest than theism. Second, the parts of source physicalism fit together better than the parts of theism. In that sense, source physicalism is more coherent than theism. I went through that very quickly, but that's how you justify premise 2. Turning to premise 3, this is where you do the extrinsic comparison of the two propositions by considering the item of evidence E identified in premise 1. In plain English, premise 3 says this: suppose we assume, purely for the sake of argument, that source physicalism is true. When we combine source physicalism with our background knowledge B, that either gives us some reason to expect E, or that gives us the lack of a reason to expect the negation of E. Now suppose we assume, again purely for the sake of argument, that theism is true. When we combine theism with our background knowledge B, that either gives us no reason to expect E, or that gives expect E or the negation of E, or that gives us a reason to expect the negation of E. When we compare the two expectations, we find that we have more reason to expect evidence E on the assumption that source physicalism is true than on the assumption that theism is true. That's premise 3. Premises 1 through 3 don't rule out the possibility that there could be other evidence which supports the opposite conclusion. For example, even if, say, the biological role of pain and pleasure is more probable on source physicalism than on theism, it might also be the case that, say, consciousness is more probable on theism than on source physicalism. Premise 4 acknowledges this possibility. That's why it has the words other evidence held equal. And so premise 4 does not claim that source physicalism is overall more probable than theism. Rather, it makes the more limited claim, other evidence held equal, source physicalism is much more probable than theism. Premise 5 is true by definition. If source physicalism is true, then, if anything mental exists, the physical caused the mental to exist. Since God is by definition mental, not physical, it follows that source physicalism entails that theism is false. Finally, 6 is the conclusion. Again, notice the wording. It doesn't say that theism is probably false. Rather, it says that, quote, other evidence held equal, theism is probably false, end quote. To get the further conclusion, theism is probably false, without the words other evidence held equal, would require additional premises. I don't show those premises here, but if you're curious, you can search for Paul Draper's article, Atheism and Agnosticism, at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and search for the section entitled The Decisive Evidence Argument. Anyway, this was a very brief introduction to how Humean arguments against theism work. So, to wrap up our discussion of section 2C, I gave Stein's presentation the worst possible rating from a technical perspective. The implied arguments he offered are just flat out wrong. I also gave them a pretty negative rating from a rhetorical perspective. I don't think one has to have philosophical training to appreciate just how unpersuasive this part of his presentation was. Let's now move on to section 3 of Dr. Stein's speech. As we've heard him say, he thinks all proofs or evidence for God's existence fit into 11 categories. I'm not going to review everything Dr. Stein says in section 3. There are 2 reasons for that. First, Dr. Bahnsen doesn't argue for the Christian worldview by appealing to any of Dr. Stein's 11 categories, and so these 11 categories are ultimately irrelevant. Second, because this debate took place in 1985, in order to do a proper assessment of each category, I would have to be familiar with the state of the literature in 1985 regarding each of these 11 categories. But I'm not familiar with the 1985 state of the literature for each of these categories, and frankly, I have no desire to invest the time to do the research required to get that familiarity. So instead of discussing all 11 categories, I want to discuss the 3 categories I am familiar with. These categories are cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments for theism. So let's begin with subsection A, the cosmological argument. We'll start by listening to what Dr. Stein said in the debate.
The first cause argument, also called the cosmological argument, it says that everything must have a cause. Therefore, the universe had a cause, and that cause was God. God was the first or uncaused cause. Okay, well, this leads into a real logical bind for the theist, because if everything must have had a cause, then God must have had a cause. If God had a cause, then he was not the first or uncaused cause. If God did not have a cause, then not everything must have a cause. If not everything needs a cause, then perhaps the universe is one of those things which doesn't need a cause. So you see that we've gotten into a logical bind there, and that proof basically fails.
Well, yeah, the way he describes it, that proof does basically fail, but that's not the proof. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stein portrays cosmological arguments as having the following form. Premise 1, everything must have a cause. Premise 2, the universe is a thing. Therefore, 3, the universe has a cause. And so 4, the cause of the universe is God. But Stein's reconstruction is a straw man. To see this, I'm going to quote Catholic philosopher Edward Feser. Quote, actually, before I read the quote, let me set it up. Feser, and that, by the way, is the correct way to say his last name, wasn't specifically referring to Gordon Stein, but he might as well have been. He writes, quote, "That is not what the cosmological argument says, and none of the philosophers who have famously defended the argument, not Aristotle, not Aquinas, not Leibniz, not anyone else, ever committed such a stupid and obvious fallacy," end quote. And so I was pretty harsh in my assessment of this portion of Dr. Stein's opening statement. From a technical perspective, he could not have done a worse job. That's why I gave him 3 down arrows. But I also think he was very ineffective from a rhetorical perspective. The average theist in the Western world, even if they had no familiarity at all with the philosophers listed by Phaser, believes that God is uncaused. So even if they weren't familiar with the cosmological argument, they would be familiar with their conception of God, and they would know that what Stein is saying conflicts with what they believe. In other words, they don't believe in a God that has a cause. For that reason, I gave Stein 2 down arrows from a rhetorical perspective. Next, let's listen to what Dr. Stein had to say about the design or teleological argument.
The second one is the design argument, also called the teleological argument. It says that the universe is wonderful and exhibits evidence of design or order. Things which show such wonderful design must have had a designer who was even more wonderful, and that designer was God. Well, if the universe is wonderfully designed, surely God is even more wonderfully designed. He must therefore have had a designer even more wonderful than he is. If God did not require a designer, then there's no reason why such a relatively less wonderful thing as the universe needed one. Again, we're into a logical self-contradiction.
Stein's remarks remind me a lot of what Richard Dawkins wrote in his book, The God Delusion. What you see on this slide and the next slide are taken word for word from Dawkins' book. It is quite wordy, so I'm not going to read it to you. If you want to read it, you can pause the video and view the slides. The key point here is simply that Dawkins gives basically the same argument as Stein. Now, if you agree with me, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, so what? Why is Lowder telling me that Dawkins uses the same argument as Stein? The answer is that philosopher Eric Wielenberg, himself a fellow atheist, has refuted Dawkins' argument. Atheist philosopher Eric Wielenberg reconstructed Dawkins' ultimate Boeing 747 gambit as follows. Premise 1, if God exists, then God has these 2 properties. 1, he provides an intelligent design explanation for all natural complex phenomena in the universe, and 2, he has no explanation external to himself. Premise 2, anything that provides an intelligent design explanation for the natural complex phenomena in the universe is at least as complex as such phenomena. 3, so if God exists, then God has these 2 properties. 1, he is at least as complex as the natural complex phenomena in the universe, and 2, he has no explanation external to himself. 4, it is very improbable that there exists something that 1 is at least as complex as the natural complex phenomena in the universe, and 2 has no explanation external to itself. 5, therefore, it is very improbable that God exists. The key point here is the difference between a contingent physical being and a necessary non-physical being. And so you see on the slide this key point. He distinguishes between 2 versions of the God hypothesis. God hypothesis 1, there exists a contingent, physical, complex, superhuman, supernatural intelligence that created the universe and has no external explanation. And God hypothesis 2, there exists a necessary, non-physical, complex, superhuman, supernatural intelligence that created the universe and has no external explanation. And again, the key point is that there's a big difference between a contingent physical being and a necessary non-physical being. And so as Wielenberg writes, quote, Dawkins' argument may be effective against GH1, but no clear-thinking Jew, Christian, or Muslim accepts that thesis. GH2 is much closer to traditional monotheism than is GH1, but Dawkins' gambit is ineffective against GH2, end quote. Therefore, as far as GH2 is concerned, premise 4 is false, and Dawkins' argument fails. It follows that premise 4 in the reconstruction of Dawkins' argument is false, Dawkins is tearing down a straw man of his own creation. And we could say basically the exact same thing about Stein's argument, or Stein's reconstruction of design arguments for God's existence. And so again, I was pretty harsh in my rating of this section of Dr. Stein's opening statement, and for basically the same reasons I gave in my assessment of section 3A. Finally, let's move on to section 3G. Let's begin by listening to what Dr. Stein said in his opening statement.
Then we have the moral argument. All people have moral values. The existence of these values cannot be explained unless they were implanted in people by a God. Therefore, God exists. Well, their answer to this is that there are simpler ways of explaining the origin of moral values without requiring the existence of a God to implant them in people.
This section is absolutely terrible. Once again, Dr. Stein is tearing down a straw man of his own creation. To see this, I want to compare Dr. Stein's reconstruction of the moral argument for theism, which is really, as is the case with all of these, a family of arguments. I want to compare Dr. Stein's reconstruction to an actual moral argument defended by an actual theist, something that was available to Dr. Stein back in 1985. And to do that, I'm going to use the argument given by C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. Now, despite the name of that book, the moral argument is not a moral argument for the Christian God, it's just an argument for theism. So a Muslim or a Jew could use this same argument. Lewis does not give his argument in standard form, and so I've actually spent quite a bit of time trying to parse through that book to figure out what the standard form of his argument would be, and I've formulated it as an abductive argument. And so as I reconstruct Lewis's argument, it has two stages. The first stage attempts to show that an objective moral law exists. To do that, we divide the relevant evidence into two kinds of propositions: B, the relevant background information, and E, the evidence to be explained. In the background information, Lewis is pointing to two facts. Number one, moral condemnation, moral justification, and moral progress assume that there is an objective truth of the matter. And number two, moral knowledge is a necessary condition for a person to be morally responsible for their behavior. The evidence to be explained, according to Lewis, also consists of two things. Number one, ordinary moral reasoning and discussion include moral condemnation and defense. And number two, as a practical matter, it is impossible to consistently deny the existence of an objective moral law. From here, as I read him, Lewis makes an explanatory argument, which could be formulated as either an inference to the best explanation or as a Bayesian argument. Ultimately, I think it makes very little difference. Here's how I've reconstructed it. Premise one, the evidence relevant to the moral law theory is known to be true. And by moral law theory, I mean the proposition an objective moral law exists. Premise two, the herd instinct theory has weak explanatory power. Premise three, the social convention theory has weak explanatory power. Premise four, the moral law theory has strong explanatory power. So, 5, the moral law theory is the best explanation of the relevant evidence. Therefore, 6, it is epistemically probable that the moral law theory is true, i.e. that the moral law exists. Now we turn to stage 2 of the argument. Stage 2, again, we divide the evidence, the relevant evidence, up into background information, or B, and then E, the evidence to be explained. In stage 2, the background information includes 3 propositions. Number 1, the materialist view entails that there is no mind behind the universe, i.e. there is no creator. The universe itself, as well as all the creatures inside it, including humans, are not the effect of a supernatural first cause or intelligent designer. Premise 2, the religious view entails, or not premise 2, but proposition 2, the religious view entails that there is a mind behind the universe, i.e. there is a creator who is conscious, has purposes, and has preferences. This mind created and designed the universe partly to produce creatures that, like it, have minds. And proposition 3, a mind behind the universe could reveal its existence to us by trying to get us to behave in a certain way. The evidence to be explained also has three propositions. Number one, or E1, human beings have moral obligations which are grounded in the moral law. E2, most human beings know at least the general principles of the moral law. And E3, most human beings experience moral emotions related to the moral law, such as guilt and obligation. And therefore, we're now in a position to formulate the argument in stage two. It goes like this. Premise one, the evidence relevant to the religious view is known to be true. Premise two, the materialist view has weak explanatory power. Premise three, the religious view has strong explanatory power. So, four, the religious view is the best explanation of the relevant evidence. And therefore, five, it is epistemically probable that the religious view is true. And of course, if the religious view is true, materialism is false, and so therefore Lewis infers the existence of God. Now, I could do a whole presentation just on Lewis's argument, maybe I will someday, but the key point here is I want you to compare this pretty complicated argument to Stein's reconstruction of moral arguments. Whatever you think of Lewis's argument, whether you think it's the best thing, the greatest thing since sliced bread, or you think it's absolutely terrible or somewhere in the middle, it is beyond any reasonable doubt that what Stein presents as a reconstruction of moral arguments is a complete and total straw man and has nothing whatsoever to do with the strongest version of the moral argument that would have been available to Stein back in 1985. And so again, to repeat what I said earlier, this subsection of Dr. Stein's speech is absolutely terrible. Once again, Dr. Stein is tearing down a straw man of his own creation. Now, you might be wondering, okay, then how would you, Lowder, critique Lewis's moral argument for God's existence? My answer to you would be to tell you to go read my forthcoming paper, the one that you can't read right now. Unfortunately, I've been sitting on it for about 10 years, tweaking it, so it's anybody's guess as to when I will actually seek publication and make it available. Anyway, let's return to Dr. Stein's opening statement. He's not yet done talking about morality.
Besides, if moral values did come from a God, then all people should have the same moral values, and they don't. People's moral values are the result of an accommodation which they have made with their particular environment and then taught to their children as a survival mechanism.
Remember the argument pattern I introduced earlier called the Humean argument? Here I am attempting to steelman Dr. Stein's speech by taking his comments and formulating them as a Humean argument against theism based on moral disagreement. I defend an argument very similar to this in my own debates on God's existence. Here's what I think here's how I would steelman what we just heard from Dr. Stein. I call it the argument from moral disagreement against theism. Premise one, the evidence relevant to moral disagreement is known to be true. Premise two, naturalism is intrinsically more probable than theism, i.e. other evidence held equal, the intrinsic probability of naturalism is greater than the intrinsic probability of theism. And as I'm reading my slide out loud, I realize that the phrase other evidence held equal shouldn't even be there because evidence is an extrinsic factor and so not relevant to the concept of intrinsic probability at all. So pretend that isn't on the slide. Too lazy to edit the slide and re-record the audio. Premise three, moral disagreement, or M, is antecedently much more probable on the assumption that naturalism is true than on the assumption that theism is true. And so four, other evidence held equal, theism is probably false. This is an argument Stein could have given, and this is, he didn't give that because, as we've seen, he thinks it's impossible to defend the proposition God does not exist, in spite of the fact that he had one argument that you could use as part of a cumulative case for the proposition God does not exist. He had that argument right in front of him and he didn't even know what to do with it. So anyway, my assessment of Section 3G was mixed. Again, from a technical perspective, I think Section 3G was absolutely horrible. Dr. Stein is flat out wrong in the way he constructs the moral argument. I also think his reconstruction was rhetorically ineffective, and so I gave him 1 down arrow for that. But I think the part where he talked about moral disagreement was rhetorically effective, and so I gave him 1 up arrow for that. Anyway, this concludes my assessment of Dr. Stein's opening statement. If you've enjoyed this review and you're not already a subscriber to my channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button. You'll get notified when I upload new videos. Also check me out on Twitter and on Blogger.